Oh man, what a week, huh? How much do you think an ethically made t-shirt costs? And how much would you be willing to pay for that ethically made shirt? Chances are, the two numbers you have in your head probably add up to a negative. Now, this is probably due to the rise of fast fashion warping consumer expectations of what something like, say, Chappell Roan Pink Pony Club shirt costs. There was a bit of discourse a couple of weeks ago around the cost of some of her $40 tour merch being too expensive and that she needs to do better, as if she's a politician and not a 26-year-old who dresses up like Bret Hart while singing about drag. Which couldn't be more appropriate since wrestling is basically just drag for cis men. I swear to God, she can't do anything without someone taking issue with it, and I can't think of another celebrity who's gotten so much shit so frequently in such a short amount of time over the dumbest things that aren't even bad. Most merch is sometimes twice as much and made less ethically, which makes me wonder, have any of these people who are complaining ever been to any concert of any kind? One person on Twitter summed this whole thing up pretty succinctly by saying, cheap shirts come at a high cost, just not to you. While some of the backlash is rooted in fast fashion's grip on consumer expectations, a lot of it also comes down to toxic parasocial bonds some fans have formed with Chappell. She's been open about her discomfort with fans crossing personal boundaries, and in response, there's this idea that she asked for it by being famous, or that she somehow owes her fans more than she already gives. The very thing that sets her apart and has made her famous are the same things some fans resent about her. They demand she meet an impossible standard and are quick to judge her as rude for setting boundaries or greedy for selling merch that costs more than a $6 Shein graphic tee, while missing the fact that if she did, they'd probably still hate her for selling fast fashion garbage. So, which is it? This backlash seems to be coming from a very, very small minority on Twitter, and I imagine the majority of her fans don't really care or are okay with spending $40 whole on a shirt. Despite how stupid this controversy is, it has created an opportunity to have an honest conversation about the cost of clothes. Again, to me that's a pretty reasonable price for tour merch, especially from the company that's producing them, Everybody World, that uses 100% reclaimed waste cotton to make their blanks. The company also states that all cutting, sewing, and finishing is done in small, family-run, fair-wage factories in Los Angeles, and that their supply chain is traceable and transparent, operating entirely within North America. They even have a handy infographic showing exactly where everything comes from and how far it travels. I feel like I can speak with a bit of authority on clothing manufacturing, both ethically and unethically, because I've worked in apparel and fashion for about 15 years now. I've worked both sales and operations for high-end designer brands, small business boutiques, and complete scam fast fashion retailers selling landfill quality crap. Thankfully, that last company is no longer in business. And I only really discovered that they were run that way after I went from sales to operations. I was shocked. Throughout the years, I've had access to pricing and buying information and manufacturing processes from across the spectrum, working for companies that would sometimes sell $60 women's tops that cost $4 to make and $8 to buy at wholesale that were made entirely of plastic. I've also worked for companies that had unionized factory workers who got paid a fair wage, making $1,500 jackets that cost only about half as much to manufacture. But in my experience, this is the exception, not the norm. Even at the luxury level of high-end fashion ready-to-wear, in most cases, you're overpaying for a shirt or jeans by several 100%. To be fair, that high markup isn't always because a company is trying to milk their white-label crap for all they can. In the case of the high-end places, you're typically paying for either the labor that goes into an intricate garment or the time it takes to create a custom pattern or design. Luxury brands aren't picking patterns out of a swatch book, they're designed in-house through a pretty laborious process of market research, trend forecasting, and inspiration gathering. I worked at Marc Jacobs for a couple of years, and we would get seasonal line sheets that included all the information for the patterns and styles, and a lot of the time there would be references to other forms of art and design, from architecture and impressionism, as well as history and culture, from early 20th century military attire all the way to the 80s punk scene. And despite also relying on overseas manufacturing, these companies do sometimes work pretty closely with those factories. And yes, some of that cost is simply in the name alone, but these companies are also employing top talent to make their clothes, and that ain't cheap either. These price points aren't completely arbitrary, it's just that the average consumer doesn't have their finger on the pulse of manufacturing and design costs, and why would they? America doesn't make anything anymore. There is also the exclusivity factor, which creates more demand, which makes something more valuable, which is deliberate and also classist. Companies don't want to dilute their brand by making clothes more accessible to poor people, which is a whole other topic of conversation. In general, if the price of something is too good to be true, then someone is getting exploited somewhere, and it probably wasn't made with very much care or intention. But if something seems overpriced, it's either made relatively sustainably or ethically, or it's priced that way to shut you out. Unfortunately. One of the reasons consumers typically don't question something with a low MSRP or manufacturer's suggested retail price, or what the true cost of goods is because Americans love a deal, and advertisers have convinced us over the decades that we need stuff in order to fit in or give our lives purpose. So you should probably buy that $14 knockoff Miu Miu shirt from Temu. I didn't just make those words up. Those are real companies selling real goods. For a long time, the majority of Americans were pretty well off and had some spending money to buy the newest fashions. If they didn't, they at least had the skill to alter or make their own clothes themselves at home that were comparable to high-quality construction of stuff you'd find at Sears. Despite the price of a 1960s color TV costing almost $4,000 in today's money, for example, people could afford it because their mortgage was like $5, and it was most likely still made in the US. The same goes for apparel, where 95% of clothing worn in the US in the 60s was made in the US, with most of those manufacturing jobs paying pretty decent wages for the time, probably due to unions being much stronger and more effective in the middle of the century. It's not even like clothing was all that more expensive anyway. This sweater was $8 in 1960, which is about $85 in today's money, and almost certainly had superior construction. Minolay has a great video about this that I recommend you go check out. I've personally sold $85 sweaters to people that were absolutely worth less in terms of their quality. Hell, I've sold $200 sweaters that were of poorer quality. Clothing 60 years ago was made by skilled workers for companies that actually made timeless quality investment pieces that didn't suffer trends and lasted longer than a weekend of wear. It's why everyone wants vintage Carhartt over new Carhartt, or a Smeg icebox from 1946 and not whatever stainless steel box Westinghouse is passing off as a refrigerator today. Brands were able to focus on making one thing really well in the 50s and 60s because there was less competition that didn't require innovation every quarter. There was less of a worry about being outpaced by another company in the trucker jacket or ham radio sector. But starting in the 70s, as manufacturing jobs were shipped overseas in favor of profit and other foreign companies started importing their own goods into the US companies diversified to the detriment of quality, becoming lifestyle brands. Take my Westinghouse example. It used to be a respected brand known for producing high-quality home appliances, especially refrigerators. They were pioneers in dependable household appliances that were built to last, with some of them chugging along 75 years later. Over the decades, however, Westinghouse diversified beyond appliances into a range of products and even ventured into making nuclear power plants? A completely logical step for a company known for keeping your frozen dinners really cold. In doing so, they lost some of their focus and quality, eventually diluting the original brand's reputation. Today, they make various products across categories, and they're often criticized for inconsistent quality with little connection to the company's origins. And there are countless examples of this in apparel and fashion. Levi's, for instance, was iconic for its durable, well-made jeans for blue-collar workers who needed long-lasting workwear. For much of the 20th century, Levi's was the go-to brand for high-quality craftsmanship, with jeans often durable enough to be passed down through generations, proven by the fact that people find intact pairs at the bottom of mine shafts pretty regularly. But as the decades passed, Levi's shifted its focus from quality to mass market appeal, expanding into a wide range of products, including cheaper, trend-driven clothing, and licensing their brand for various non-denim items. This is a pretty common thing for brands now to become the dreaded all-in-one lifestyle brand when nobody asked for that. Except weirdos who have Coca-Cola themed kitchens. Stop it. Just make one thing and do it well. This shift was partly due to the decline of Cone Mills, Levi's main source of denim, which gradually closed factories across the US, with their last plant closing in 2017. Starting in 1915, the majority of Levi's denim was supplied by Cone Mills, but by the 80s and 90s, Levi's began outsourcing manufacturing to meet the demands of a growing global market and reduced costs. Reagan! By the time the last Cone Mills plant closed in 2017, only a small fraction of Levi's denim was manufactured in the US. It's important to understand that a clothing brand typically isn't also a textile manufacturer. It's rare for a brand to own every level of production, from raw materials to final distribution. A company controlling multiple stages of production in the same industry is what's known as vertical integration that can be extremely expensive and complicated to sustain. And while it isn't technically illegal, Lena Khan might just kick your fucking door down if it's achieved through a merger. Well, while she still has a job, since Trump plans to demolish the deep state, which just means fire everyone who isn't loyal to him. But I digress. Most clothing brands rely on multiple suppliers for raw materials in production. Even though wages can still fall short of livable in the US, it's still far more expensive to produce goods domestically, not only due to payroll, but also because of significant overhead costs such as importing materials, health and safety compliance, building maintenance, utilities, and insurance that a factory environment incurs. For now, shit's gonna get real unsafe come January 6th. And expensive because of Trump's genius idea to impose tariffs on, I guess, everything. You're paying for those. It's not China.
And this thought here is that, okay, well, hey, tariffs will cause a reordering of global supply chains, right? We'll move away from the more expensive Chinese manufacturer in the example I gave to then build within America and avoid the higher expenses of tariffs. The thing is that actually results in even more expensive goods for U.S. citizens, and it's for two reasons. It has to do with much higher labor costs within the United States because we pay our people way more than a lot of international countries, as well as we will have to import in raw materials in order to make those goods, and those raw materials will be hit with those tariffs. Now, against it, you could say, okay, well, the United States will plant more wheat. The United States will produce more steel. The United States will produce more of the raw materials. The thing is, we're the largest consumption market in the world. We cannot produce all of the raw materials needed in order to make the items needed to satisfy our consumption levels. And the other thing, too, is if we build more American, we're hit with those wage expenses, and those wage expenses get pushed onto the end consumer. So once again, we still find ourselves in a situation where the profit margins for companies, both internationally, the exporter, as well as the U.S. companies, those profit margins remain the same or even improve, but the cost to the end consumer drastically increases.
Countries that companies source materials and labor from are pretty famous for not prioritizing these things due to even more lax safety codes than the US currently enforces. These costs, coupled with the trend toward broader diversification into new product categories, often lead companies to shift towards faster, cheaper, and less consistent and ethical overseas manufacturing practices. I'm probably tapped into all this because of my work history, but I was under the impression that people in general were a little more aware than it seems they are about how unethical and unsustainable modern fashion is. Every month there's a new documentary or controversy or building collapse, and yet fast fashion companies like H&M and Temu and Shein have gotten really popular simply due to how dirt cheap their products are. We're all up in arms whenever an influencer gets paid by one of these companies to spread their fast fashion propaganda, only to forget about it a couple weeks later. This peer pressure and accessibility, as well as shorter trend cycles, has perpetuated either ignorance or apathy or both toward the devastation fast fashion causes, usually justified as retail therapy during times of hardship. Consumers end up at a crossroads of not wanting to pay for sustainable clothing because they either don't understand where that money is going, don't give a shit, or they do and are just broke while also feeling the pressure to conform by consuming. There's a fear of being alienated from whatever their in-group is, which is as unsustainable as the clothing they're buying. And look, you're not a bad person if you can't afford the best clothing, and I'm not shaming anyone for being poor. The system is rigged against you on purpose. I was broke for a long time, and if I'm being honest, am one medical diagnosis away from going bankrupt myself right now. None of this is to say you should just opt out of participating in fashion, because it is still a valuable creative outlet. But it's also turned into a content opportunity of spectacle, with haul videos being their own genre right here on YouTube. Companies and influencers have bastardized fashion into something that's no longer about fashion as an art form, and people complaining about the price of ethically made clothing and creators making fashion content just feeds into that idea. These people aren't giving styling tips or talking about designers or professing their love of fashion as an art form. They're dumping a big pile of plastic out on their bedroom floor and trying each piece on for a couple seconds in a get ready with me video, never to be worn again. It's this kind of content and flippant treatment of clothing and fashion that perpetuates wasteful consumption habits and emboldens companies to not become more sustainable themselves. Not only that, but it maintains this stereotype that fashion is something only wealthy people are allowed to participate in, or that if you're into fashion, you're pretentious or gay, and that it has no intrinsic value as a meaningless frivolity. In reality, that may be true in terms of its intrinsic economic value, as branding and pricing seem to be subjective, but fashion absolutely has intrinsic artistic, cultural, and social value. And speaking of economic value, businesses typically apply what's called a keystone markup when pricing their goods. This is a common industry practice of doubling manufacturing costs for wholesale and doubling that for MSRP. Keystone pricing is a pretty standard retail pricing strategy where the sale price is set at roughly double the wholesale cost, creating a 50% margin. If a product costs $25 to manufacture, a retailer pays about $50 at wholesale and then sells it to you for $100. Smaller manufacturers and direct-to-consumer brands sometimes set their manufacturing costs as the wholesale price, especially if they're focusing more on simplifying pricing than on maximizing profit at a wholesale level. Traditionally, wholesalers usually make a clear distinction between cost and wholesale, especially those selling primarily to other businesses. B2B. I cut my manufacturing costs in half by poisoning an entire community and industry, and this is what it taught me about B2B sales. They'll often mark up their manufacturing costs by 50 to 100% to account for their warehousing, logistics, and operational expenses, and to ensure a consistent profit. For larger brands with structured supply chains, distinguishing between manufacturing and wholesale pricing is necessary for covering expenses and also staying competitive. Keystone markup has been used for decades, especially in brick-and-mortar stores, because it's easy and saves time calculating shipping, storage, and operational costs in a spreadsheet and tracking how long it takes Gary in the warehouse to retrieve and pack and ship your Shrek Crocs. There are drawbacks though, like how it can lead to higher prices for consumers. Unlike value-based pricing, which factors in competitors' prices and customer perception of worth, Keystone pricing doesn't consider market competition, product quality, or brand identity, meaning it's best suited for mid-range retailers and those that function as a wholesaler first and direct-to-consumer retailer second. Luxury brands and specialty retailers often use markups well above Keystone since customers expect a premium associated with the brand's exclusivity or quality, but they don't have to. When Shades of Grey stopped wholesaling and switched to DTC sales in 2017, they were able to cut their prices almost in half. Conversely, some mass market brands may use smaller markups to attract consumers on a budget. And while it's not universal, it does at least give the average shopper an idea of what something probably costs to make. Now, applying this to the blanks that Chappell used for her tour merch, Everybody World sells blanks directly to consumer for $40. And being the manufacturer and wholesaler themselves, they probably cost $10 to produce, so their wholesale price is probably $20. But that also depends on the quantity that you're buying. They might discount unit pricing when buying the larger quantities, but none of this takes into account the cost Chappell paid to ship and screen print the shirts as well. At the end of the day, she probably made like $10 on every shirt, which is a pretty standard 25% profit margin for clothing sales. I mean, merch is rarely about making huge profits anyway. Its function is to be a walking billboard for your brand. Or band. I know for a lot of people, $40 is a pretty steep price to pay for a t-shirt, ethically made or not. Again, I don't want to sound like I'm shaming anyone who doesn't buy ethically sustainable clothing. I was never really able to buy clothes that way, and growing up myself, I got hand-me-downs from family members that shopped for shoes at Payless. Even in my 20s and 30s, I wasn't buying anything I couldn't get a deal on and often had negative money in my bank account. I'm sure a lot of Chappell's fans are on the younger side who still rely on their parents for most necessities. And I want to be clear, this isn't aimed at them. For everyone else, particularly men in their 40s complaining about the cost of Gen Z tour merch on Instagram for some reason, you gotta understand what goes into that price tag. Many consumers don't realize that it's a reflection of fair wages for workers, sustainable materials, responsible production practices, and cost of raw imported materials, and everyone who is mad about this is mad that she's doing the correct thing. At the same time, we also have to recognize our role as consumers. When we choose to support brands that prioritize ethics and sustainability, we're not just buying a shirt, we're investing in a more equitable and environmentally friendly future. I mean, the burden of global warming shouldn't be placed at the feet of consumers in the first place, but here we are. Foundation for Shared Impact did a study and found that if brands like H&M charged just 12 cents for every t-shirt sold, they'd be able to pay workers a living wage, and that the waste created by fast fashion is responsible for about 10% of global carbon emissions, surpassing emissions from international flights and maritime shipping combined. So if a massive company like H&M took some of their profits and put it towards implementing more sustainable practices, their shareholders and CEOs would still be multimillionaires. On the other hand, ethical brands often invest in practices that reduce their carbon footprint by using organic or recycled/reclaimed materials and sustainable manufacturing. For them, the cost is going into offsetting emissions and paying people a livable wage, not exploiting them. It should be obvious that fast fashion also leads to massive waste beyond emissions, with about 21 billion pounds of textiles sent to US landfills each year, with around 70% of clothing that's collected for donation in the US being exported to other countries like Ghana and Kenya and India. We're not just polluting our own country, we're dumping our acrylic knitwear garbage in the backyard of other countries that lack the infrastructure to manage textile waste at the scale imported, and now we're all juiced up on microplastics. But out of sight, out of mind, I guess. Now, I don't want to sound like a complete doomer and fearmonger for 25 minutes, because there is some hope. Consumer choices are playing an increasingly significant role in shaping market trends, particularly as demand for sustainable fashion rises in response to changing societal and cultural values. And the fact that we're all gonna burst into flames in 7 years? According to a Deloitte report, 46 of global consumers purchased at least one sustainable product in April 2023, showing a growing demand for greener products despite economic uncertainty. The report also found that consumers are willing to pay a premium for sustainable products, with 27% more on average for items that meet sustainability standards. And as much as social media is used to promote fast fashion and non-sustainable clothing through influencers just trying to get that bag, there are creators using their platform to promote ethical brands and a culture of sustainability. I already mentioned Minalay, but she's a good resource who I only recently discovered and has talked about sustainable clothing and advocates for informed consumption like thrifting and repurposing. But consumers still struggle to determine what makes a product sustainable because brands greenwash their products all the time, making it hard to know who to trust. Many mistakenly view packaging as the primary indicator of quality, but overlook other critical factors such as materials, supply chains, and the human capital involved in production, because how are you supposed to get that out of a brand if they don't freely offer it? But again, this is done deliberately by brands who would prefer things stay the same rather than affecting a positive impact on the market and the planet, and thus their bottom line. The best way to get brands to change is to simply not give them your money. Stop buying clothes from Shein and Temu, and instead save up and buy something that will last from a trusted, transparent company making quality stuff. Sure, that $10 H&M shirt might have been affordable when you bought it, but you're probably going to replace it several times over the course of a year, thereby spending the same amount of money that you would have on a pack of $90 Whitesville tees you'll own for many more years. Just make sure you size up, they shrink a lot. If you live in a city, the better option is to go to one of these boutique stores that carry expensive clothing and talk to the staff. They're typically nerds about this kind of thing and can give you some recommendations on where to start if $90 for 2 white tees is still intimidating. Buy timeless classics that don't suffer trends. ignore influencers making empty get ready with me content, and for the love of God, leave Chappell Roan alone. That's the video. Thanks so much for sticking around. If you made it this far, that means you're special and you care about the environment. I wanted to record a different video today that I haven't written it for, which I know sounds stupid, but I made a post on the community section of the channel talking about how, you know, I don't want people to think that I'm just going to go back to business as usual, making fun of like cringy people on the internet. I mean, I'm going to still do that, but I also want to just let everybody know that this is a safe space and also a welcoming space, right? There's been a lot of discourse since the election about, you know, this epidemic of white male loneliness, and that if you're a white leftist on the internet, you should start a podcast and really try and embrace those people so they don't go down the fucking alt-right pipeline, which that's what the next video is going to be about. I have a lot of thoughts. I know a lot of people are scared and worried about what's to come. And so am I. You know, I don't have an answer. And it's frustrating. But I'm going to take my time with this next video to make sure it's not just me, you know, being pissed. I want to really have a thoughtful conversation about that specifically, about, you know, these young Gen Z guys who overwhelmingly voted conservative. And it sucks because there's a better way to live your life. And there's a better way to, I don't know, view other people who are different than you. And I want to talk directly to them next week, or maybe 10 days from now, or maybe 2 weeks from now. I don't know. Again, I want to make sure I write this script in a thoughtful manner. And fuck it, maybe I will just start a podcast. We'll see. Comment below if you want to see a podcast with me. I don't know, fucking just sitting here rambling like I have been for the last couple of minutes. Anyway, I know there's a weird outro, but I just wanted to reassure everybody that I love and care about you, genuinely. I know that's a crazy thing for some guy on the internet to say that, but I do. I really appreciate the community that has been created here, and I want to continue to, you know, maintain that and encourage that. So that's it. Kind of a heavy outro, I know, but that's the video. Until next time, vanish.